fantasticus that you can Google and run down, chapter 25, verse 24. Within the New Testament, 1 Timothy 2:14, Romans 5:12 through 21 will identify Eve as making this mistake of then leading man into quote-unquote sin, right? Verse 13, notice God will speak to Eve and asks, what have you done? Notice this is again asked in chapter 4, verse 10, when we get to the Cain and Abel story. Notice it's an interesting truth. Often it's only after the fact, think about this, that we understand the implications of our actions. A compelling lesson being taught here in the early part of the Bible. Notice there is the blaming of the serpent for tricking her, right? Of course, the question is, how did the serpent actually trick her? It's a fun question to ask. Verses 14 through 19, now we're going to have some amazing poetry. And again, we noticed this already in chapters 1 and 2, when God speaks sometimes in poetry. And notice here we'll have this. And we have the beginning of what we will call the curses, right? In other words, it's pretty clear that this is not a happy moment. This is not a good thing. This is construed as obviously a very bad thing. Notice the order that God will speak in. First to the serpent, then to the woman, then to the man, and then finally to an us that we'll have to talk about. To the serpent, and by the way, the curse here is that you'll crawl on your belly every time. It's a kind of a symbol, right? Every time you see the serpent crawling, you're reminded of the story. Of course, it does beg the question, did the serpent character walk on legs before? Much has been kind of speculated about this. Notice in verse 15, we have, of course, Christian readers that are going to see this as a promise of someday Jesus Christ. But if you don't read it that way, you can still read it as an understanding that there's going to be this relationship that once existed between humans and nature that's somehow damaged in some way. To Eve, notice there is no actual curse, although it seems to be implied. Pangs in childbearing seems to suggest, of course, what every parent knows, that kids can be pains. Of course, you could make the argument that really the punishment here is that a woman has to do two jobs, having the babies, having the children, and of course also working, right? This desire for her husband is going to be a central motif. The idea, and you will see this a lot in the book of Genesis, that a woman is somehow defined by her husband, right? And getting a husband for a young daughter seems to be a huge project. The idea that he will rule over you is an interesting Hebrew word. The word in Hebrew is mashal, and it's spoken of actually good kings, Solomon and Hezekiah. 1 Kings 4:30, for those of you that want to run that one down. We do ask, of course, this question, is this really the beginning of the patriarchy? We'll talk about Aristotle's patriarchal view later. The idea that first gods exist, and then below the gods you have men, and below men you have women. Is this the beginning of that in some ways within the Bible? Lots has been said about this. 1 Timothy 2:15 is an interesting passage if you want to run it down. A woman is saved through childbearing. Of course, you have the idea that women do die during childbearing. We think of Jacob's Rachel and, of course, the birth of Benjamin, Genesis 35:18. We'll talk more about this one later. Finally, God will speak to the man. And notice the first thing that is said is, because you listen to the voice of your wife. We're going to follow this idea of men listening to their wives. We'll think of Abraham, for example, listening to the voice of his wife in Genesis 21:12. Notice that Adam is not actually cursed, but the ground is cursed. Again, notice one more break in the relationship between humans and nature. Notice the relationship, toil or work, and the soil or dirt, and sweat. Let's just point out here that you have this recognition that life is going to be really hard. Notice as well here, Adam now must take care of himself instead of course, in the Edenic kind of situation where God takes care of him. Also, you have this idea about the honoring of the Sabbath, honoring of work, honoring of rest. Deuteronomy 5:12, 15 also seems to suggest that the Sabbath was about the release from slavery in Egypt. Again, forced labor. We do have some interesting examples of other curses in the Bible. We will, in our next lecture, in fact, meet one of them in Genesis 4. Cain is cursed from the ground, chapter 4, verse 11. This is fascinating continuation. I'm just trying to show you the way that this text is remarkably tied together. Christ will curse the fig tree, the famous cursing of the fig tree in Matthew 21, 18 through 22, also Mark 11, 12 through 14. The Galatians 3:13 passage, cursed is he who hangs on a tree, kind of derives from the Deuteronomy 21:22 through 23 passage about executing of criminals. Verse 21 is an interesting then transition. Adam decides to name Eve now, and does so by calling her mother of all living, which continues that project of earlier when Adam was naming all of the creation of God. The irony, of course, is obvious given the pain that was already predicted for childbirth. And of course, it's a question of, is this a compliment or actually a curse that Adam places on Eve? Most have read this as a compliment. Notice that God makes garments. Obvious question is, did he kill an animal to get these skins? And is this again kind of a continuation of that disruption between humans and deity, and nature and deity? God continues, notice, to care for his creation, even though driven out of Eden they are. Verse 22, of course, becomes one of the most talked about verses of this story. The word then continues the order of the storytelling, the amazing structure here. Notice the word see. This has been a whole story about sight from start to finish. The us seems to be the heavenly council, chapter 126. Obviously, you can go to Job 1 and 2 to kind of get this idea that God is surrounded by other kinds of figures. Notice, man has become like one of us. Interesting, no mention of the woman. Notice the word like. Is that the same as saying one of us to say like one of us? And the question of the inflection of the voice has always been a question here. So, for example, is God saying, now man has become as us, like, oh, man? Or, yes, now man has become as one of us. How do you read this? What is the inflection of the voice that is used? Obviously, the question is this a fall? Is it sin? Where humans, for example, if you understand this action as sin or fall, the obvious question is, were humans more like God before they sinned or after they sinned? Before the fall or after the fall? This is, of course, an interesting question if you're going to read this story as sin and fall. Notice the latter part. Now the concern is he might reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and live forever. This seems to suggest that at this moment, then humans are not immortal. And I love this beautiful imagery of reaching out the hand. Of course, we think immediately, don't we, of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel and that reaching of the hand of God, and of course all of that. The fountain of youth questions obviously permeate here as well. You know, this notion that human beings are always looking for some place to get back to that will then give them some kind of longevity of life, right? Immortality of a kind. Verse 23, God sends him out to do the very thing he was created to do in chapter 2, till the ground. But what about Eve? No mention of her. I would point out that, of course, we read this chapter from the Bible so that we can get ready to read Milton's Paradise Lost, a classic work of literature. And, of course, at the end, Milton has them leave hand in hand, which is a classic touch. But notice, not mentioned here in this story. Verse 24, he drove them out again. He drove them out. He drove out the man. Again, notice interesting, no mention of Eve here. The Ezekiel 28, 13 through 16 passage, I would recommend that you look at this one on your own. It's some amazing stuff. And of course, this notion of being at the east, again, you can look at Ezekiel 10, 19 on your own. And there, the word cherubim is used. Now, these are winged creatures, kind of like the Sphinx of Egypt, half man, half lion. We think immediately, don't we, of the riddle of the Sphinx in Oedipus Rex. And of course, what was that all about? What does it mean to be a human being, right? Walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 legs at noon, and on 3 legs in the evening because of the staff, right? Statues like this, by the way, did guard the sanctuaries in Jerusalem, scholars tell us. And of course, you can read about this in 1 Kings 6, 23 through 28, also 32 and 35 verses. The word drove is an interesting word. It seems to suggest they didn't want to leave. This is why Milton will call it Paradise Lost. Let's now work through in our final seconds here, the annotation now at level 2A. What does this text actually mean? Again, many scholars have called this an etiology, that is to say an origin story. But the question obviously is, what is lost? What is found? What is gained here? Many have seen this as the theodicy question as it's introduced. Certainly Milton saw it this way. What is that question? something really terrible has happened. For example, as I often will talk about this, a child dying of leukemia, the mother sitting next to the child. You come into the hospital room, it's so terrible, and the mother says, yes, I wish there was a God who had the power to solve, to take away my child's leukemia. And you say, oh no, there is an all-powerful God. And the mother says, well, that God must not be very nice or very loving, or obviously would solve. No, there is an all-loving God. This is the theodicy question. How do you explain the fact that an all-loving, all-powerful deity, and still in the world we have terrible pain and suffering? Certainly many readers of this text have said that theodicy question is going to be answered, or at least introduced to be answered here in this passage. We'll think of the story of Job, and we'll meet it later. And of course, Milton's Paradise Lost is in large measure written for the very reason of answering that question. But for you, does this story actually explain why there is suffering in the world? I'll let you think about that one. Notice this quest to be like God. We'll meet this in the Tower of Babel story of Genesis 11. Is this a story about what it means to be mortal? For example, we've often said the only difference between you and a fly is that you know about fly swatters. That is no throwaway line. And here, of course, for the first time, we have this idea that knowledge has something to do with mortality and the recognition of mortality. Notice that there's no mention of afterlife in this story. There's no mention of heaven or hell. Maybe hell is the loss of Eden. You think about that one. Okay. The question of Eve's choice, is it a mistake or is it a victory? We should point out this has not always been read as a mistake. For example, the early Gnostic thinkers, this is a Christian sect of the 2nd century, they actually saw Eve as heroic, and this was not a popular idea in Christian thought, but it became at least one strand of heretical Christian teaching. Did Eve's choice lead to knowledge of the good? We think here immediately of Plato's Republic and the idea of the good. Can you know good without knowing evil? Again, we're back to this question of Taoism and the yin-yang. And what of Adam? 1 Timothy 2:14 will argue, interestingly, that Adam was not deceived but was rather seduced. In other words, he loved Eve and wanted to be with Eve, and that's why he took from the fruit. By the way, Milton will argue something very similar. That is to say, some kind of conscious solidarity with Eve, we might say. Of course, for Milton, this hand in hand as they leave Eden continues that idea. What about verse 16, this idea of having dominion over? We mentioned already Aristotle's patriarchal view outlined to some degree in the understanding of God's men, women. Is this the idea? And the word prevail suggests that men will be the primary breadwinner. Is this still the way things are in the world, or has things changed to some degree? We can read this story as kind of a story that's going to be interpreted differently depending on the time in which we're reading the story. What about Eden as a symbol? Is Eden desirable? Is it a return to childhood? We'll think about the great romantic poet Blake and his Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience here. Can we ever get back to Eden? Think about Voltaire's, for example, classic Candide and the notion of El Dorado. Right? Candide has to leave because he has to go and find his girl, right? So Cunegonde. What about the environmentalist reading? Right? Is it true that humans have a propensity to ruin paradise, to ruin Eden, somehow to destroy what it is that is environmentally perfect? Of course, we pointed out already that even though the fruit is not actually an apple, it has historically and in literature and art been the case. We think, of course, don't we, of any number of texts. Sleeping Beauty comes to mind, J.D. Salinger's short story Teddy. If you don't know that story, I recommend you Google it and read it to play this game of the apple. Keep thinking about your own meanings. So many, that come to mind here. Let's jump now to 2b, shall we? The idea of rhetorical reading, how the author says what the author says. This is, to me, amazing storytelling. It really is. You have primary conflicts, don't you? Right? We have internal conflicts, we have external conflicts, right? And in fact, when we think about conflict at all, and we teach it that way, we talk about internal conflict, character versus self, and then we talk about external conflict, character versus another character, character versus nature, character versus society or an idea, and all of a sudden you go, whoa, all of those conflicts are here in one text. Amazing, truly amazing passage in so many ways, right? The power of the poetry, we've pointed out already, the place markers to keep you wanting to know what happens next. I wonder what happens next. I wonder what happens next. Let's talk level 3a really quickly. The relationship to other texts. Boy, oh boy, is this important. Within the Bible, It's interesting how few comments there are about this story, and we should obviously ask why. For example, let's ask the simple question, does Christ ever mention this story? Ever? And if not, why? And if so, how and in what ways? Why is this story, for example, not referenced for the existence of evil in the world? That's a very interesting question. Why not more about who the snake is, Satan or the devil, for example? By the way, the term Satan only actually is used 9 times in the Hebrew Bible. You can Google this on your own. 5 times to represent some kind of human opponent, 4 times to talk about a divine being. You can Google this on your own. It's a fascinating study, and I recommend it for you. In the New Testament, Matthew 3, Mark 1:12, Satan is kind of an opponent or deceiver of Jesus, and that Matthew 4 chapter is a remarkable study. I mean, if you put that one, and we will later, the temptations of Christ, as it's often referred to, and it's an amazing commentary, and notice that one of the temptations is actually about food. Very interesting. Paul in Romans 5:18, 1 Corinthians 12:21 through 22, interestingly puts the blame not on so much Satan, but rather on humans for making a poor choice. There is this notion of the English Romantics. I've already mentioned Blake's Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. Shelley's Frankenstein is, of course, the classic novel here. The idea that the creature is the monster created by Frankenstein learns how to read by reading of all texts, of course, Milton's Paradise Lost. And obviously this text, as I have talked about in another lecture on Frankenstein, the blame game. Do you blame the monster for the terrible things the monster does, or do you rather blame Dr. Frankenstein, the creator? And obviously the implications are challenging. I think it's important here at 3a that we mention St. Augustine and his Confessions in City of God. A major Christian thinker for us. And it is in really many ways St. Augustine who introduces for Western thought the idea that this is the story of the fall, the penultimate moment, and this idea will have prodigious influence in the history of Western thought. Milton's Paradise Lost, of course, is the text of all texts in this regard. He will say it in the opening lines of that invocation of the Muse. He wants to justify the ways of God to men. That is to say, this is his answer to the theodictic question. Of course, for Milton, the answer is simple. Humans had to be created capable of choosing to disobey God. That's what he calls free will, sometimes referred to as agency. Without that, humans could not be free. And therefore, this eating of the fruit is the first act of free will, of choice. And of course, because this is the case, there must be divine justice, as Milton will talk about it. In some ways, Milton, however, also sees this as a love story between Adam and Eve. Hand in hand, they leave Eden together. What are your favorite movies and shows that reference this story? There's got to be a bunch. Finally, at 3b, how do you relate personally to this story? Is this a story, for example, that you've always kind of heard about but never actually read? And how does this reading of the story now change things for you in some way? My hope is that our study here is beginning to excite you for the reading and study of further chapters to come. We are only 3 chapters into this book, and we're already demonstrating the dynamic complexity. These are not simple questions that we're asking. They are questions that will be continued to be asked. Now, as we turn to chapter 4, we're going to talk about families. And immediately, of course, we'll think in the Western tradition of the great texts about families from, of course, East of Eden, Steinbeck's classic, as well as, of course, Death of Salesman or Long Day's Journey into Night, these texts that we study. The first family. We'll also ask about what it means to be a son, what it means to be a brother. I hope that you can begin to enjoy this study, and I hope that you will come back to join me again for our next lecture. Thank you very much.